There are moments powerful people forget because forgetting costs them nothing. Serena Caldwell forgot one of those moments. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It didn't even feel important. But for two poor black boys who stood on the edge of that moment, forgetting was never an option. They carried it forward through years of scarcity, watching how the world rewarded indifference and punished presence. This story isn't about revenge. It's about meaning, about how wealth can bury responsibility, but it cannot erase impact, and how the past, when ignored long enough, finds its way back through the people who were never meant to matter. The moment did not announce itself when it happened. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses who mattered in the ways power defines importance. It existed in the narrow space between intention and neglect, the kind of moment history often discards because it lacks spectacle. For Serena Caldwell, it was a fragment of time she would later compress, smooth over, and file away under the polished architecture of success. For the world, it never officially occurred. Years later, Serena's name carried weight that bent rooms. Her wealth moved markets. Her philanthropy reshaped neighborhoods she no longer walked through. Her public image had been engineered with precision, measured statements, curated appearances, an empire protected by lawyers, publicists, and carefully timed generosity. Every story told about her reinforced the same idea: self-made brilliance, disciplined resilience, controlled ascent. The narrative was clean, aspirational, and profitable. Nothing in it allowed space for unresolved moments from before the climb. She understood reputation as a form of currency. It could be invested, diversified, protected. When necessary, it could also be insulated. Serena had learned early that the past only had power if you allowed it to remain visible. So she buried what did not serve the future she was building. Not with malice, but with efficiency. Some memories were simply deemed unnecessary to carry forward. Yet beneath the architecture of her public life, there existed a moral residue she never fully examined. It was not a dramatic wrongdoing, not an act that would have shattered her image if exposed. That was precisely why it was dangerous. It was small. It was dismissible. It was the kind of moment wealth teaches you to overlook because acknowledging it offers no return. Serena believed money had absorbed it, diluted it, rendered it irrelevant. The contrast between who Serena appeared to be and who she was in that forgotten instant remained unresolved. Publicly, she represented progress, empowerment, control. Privately, there was a thin silence she avoided, a memory she had edited down until it felt abstract. She never named it as guilt. She framed it as context, as timing, as an unavoidable outcome of prioritizing survival in a competitive world. The language she used to describe it to herself was careful, managerial, emotionally sterile. What made the moment dangerous was not what happened, but how easily it could have been handled differently. It required attention, presence, a pause. Instead, it passed unacknowledged, slipping into the background as Serena moved forward. The world rewarded her momentum. Opportunities multiplied, recognition followed. The silence around that moment hardened into permanence. For an audience looking back, the emotional disturbance comes from its scale. Nothing dramatic occurred. No confrontation. No spectacle. Just a choice made in passing, weighted by imbalance and sealed by indifference. It is devastating precisely because it feels familiar. Many moments like it exist in the shadows of success, ignored because they slow progress or complicate narratives. This one mattered because of who was present and who was not seen. Cinematically, the moment functions like a buried frame in a reel of film. It flashes too quickly to be registered consciously, yet it alters everything that follows. Serena's life continued on its upward trajectory, untouched on the surface. But elsewhere, unseen lives absorbed the impact. The camera of public memory never panned in their direction. There was no incentive to look. What Serena never accounted for was that memory does not require permission to survive. Even when one party forgets, another may carry the weight forward. The past does not always demand recognition immediately. Sometimes it waits, patient and intact, preserved in the minds of those who had no power to rewrite it. The story begins here not because this moment defines Serena, but because it reveals the limits of control. Wealth can manage perception, but it cannot erase consequence. The smallest acts of neglect can echo longest when they intersect with vulnerability. Serena believed the moment had dissolved into nothing. She believed it had no witnesses that mattered. She was wrong. Somewhere beyond the reach of her influence, two unseen witnesses carried that moment intact, unaltered by success or distance, waiting for meaning to surface where it had once been denied. Serena Caldwell's rise did not happen in a straight line, but it always moved forward. She came from a background where ambition was present but resources were limited, where effort had to be precise because mistakes were expensive. From an early age, she learned to filter distraction from necessity. Noise existed everywhere, opinions, expectations, warnings, but she trained herself to treat it as irrelevant data. What mattered was trajectory. Her intelligence expressed itself less in brilliance and more in control. Serena observed patterns quickly, understood incentives instinctively, and adapted without sentiment. She did not wait for permission or validation. When doors did not open, she studied the structure until she found another entrance. Discipline became her defining trait. She woke earlier, stayed later, and measured progress in outcomes rather than feelings. Over time, this discipline hardened into identity. As her career expanded, Serena became skilled not only at building businesses, but at shaping how those businesses were understood. She learned that success was not just about performance but perception. Every venture came with a story, and Serena ensured she authored it. Failures were reframed as lessons. Setbacks became strategic pauses. Nothing was allowed to linger long enough to weaken momentum. When wealth followed, it arrived decisively. Serena crossed thresholds others spent lifetimes approaching. With each financial milestone, her distance from uncertainty grew. Stability replaced anxiety. Influence replaced vulnerability. She began to understand power as insulation, a buffer between her and the unpredictable consequences of human connection. The impact was real, but it was also curated. Serena understood how generosity could reinforce narrative, how giving could be both meaningful and strategic. The public saw a woman lifting others while ascending herself, and the image held. What changed quietly was how Serena related to the past. As her life filled with complexity and responsibility, reflection began to feel inefficient. Looking back offered no measurable return. There were no metrics for emotional accounting, no charts that justified slowing down. Success trained her to prioritize motion over introspection. If something did not directly affect forward progress, it was categorized as resolved by default. This habit shaped her emotional interior. Detachment became a form of self-protection. She did not dwell on moments that lacked clarity or closure. Ambiguity was treated as a distraction. Over time, this made her remarkably effective and subtly unreachable. Relationships became functional. Empathy remained intact in theory but distant in practice. She cared, but at a remove that preserved control. The admiration surrounding Serena grew alongside a faint unease she rarely acknowledged. Those closest to her noticed the way she moved through rooms without fully entering them. Conversations ended cleanly without residue. Emotional exchanges were brief, efficient, and rarely revisited. Serena did not regret this. It felt necessary, it felt earned. Her rise above the noise was celebrated because it mirrored a familiar ideal: resilience without sentiment, achievement without hesitation. Few questioned what had been left behind because the results were undeniable. Serena had built something formidable. She had proven that focus could overcome circumstance, yet elevation has consequences beyond visibility. As Serena climbed, the ground below did not disappear. It simply receded from view. The higher she went, the quieter the echoes became until they were indistinguishable from background silence. She mistook this silence for resolution. What Serena did not recognize was that some things do not compete for attention. They do not interrupt success or demand acknowledgement. They wait. They remain intact beneath progress, unaffected by distance or time. Her ascent placed her far above the moment she had buried, but it did not dissolve it. The audience begins to sense the imbalance here. Admiration is earned, but unease lingers. Serena's success is real, yet incomplete. The story suggests that while she rose above the noise, something below her continued to listen, unchanged, patient, and unmoved by the height she achieved. Ely Brooks and Marcus Reed grew up in a place that rarely appeared on maps meant for opportunity. Their neighborhood existed in the margins of attention, where infrastructure aged without repair and promises arrived already broken. Poverty shaped their days, but it did not define them in the way outsiders often assumed. There was dignity in how they moved through the world, an unspoken understanding that survival required awareness, not surrender. Ely, the older of the two, learned early how to read silence. He noticed which adults spoke with authority and which were ignored, which rules bent for some and hardened for others. Scarcity sharpened his perception. Every absence taught him something about presence. He understood that fairness was not evenly distributed and that attention itself was a form of currency rarely extended to people like them. Marcus experienced the same environment differently. Younger, quieter, He absorbed details without immediately categorizing them. Where Eli analyzed, Marcus felt. He noticed tone distance, the subtle shifts in how people's expressions changed when money or power entered a space. Together, they formed a balance. One questioned the world, the other remembered it. Their bond was not dramatic or performative. It was built through routine and proximity, through shared walks and unspoken agreements. They learned to depend on each other without ceremony. In a place where instability was normal, consistency mattered more than affection. They trusted each other because there was no alternative. Poverty did not make them bitter, but it did make them observant. They saw how systems operated without explanation. They understood that injustice was often quiet, enacted through indifference rather than cruelty. This awareness did not come from lectures or books. It came from watching doors close without explanation and noticing who was never asked to wait. Their environment offered few visible exits, yet meaning began to form anyway. It appeared in small decisions, in how they interpreted what happened around them. Where opportunity was scarce, interpretation became powerful. They learned that while they could not control circumstances, they could decide what those circumstances meant. This is where the story resists sentimentality. Eli and Marcus were not defined by struggle as a narrative device. Their lives were not preparation for redemption. They were simply living within constraints, responding with the limited tools available. The dignity in their poverty came from their refusal to erase themselves, even when the world suggested they were insignificant. Their shared environment taught them that moments mattered differently depending on who experienced them. What passed unnoticed for some could become formative for others. They did not yet understand how deeply this truth would shape them, only that it existed. Meaning for them did not arrive through opportunity but through attention. They noticed what others ignored. They remembered what others discarded. In this way, their lives began to orient around memory. Not nostalgia, but preservation. They carried moments forward because forgetting felt like another form of loss. As they grew, the edges of their world pressed closer. Decisions became heavier. The future felt both urgent and abstract. They did not speak openly about escape or success. Those concepts felt distant, undefined. Instead, they focused on navigating what was immediately in front of them, trusting that clarity would arrive later. Unbeknownst to them, a moment already existed that would bind their lives to a world far removed from their own. It was buried beneath layers of privilege and distance, dismissed by someone who never needed to remember it. For Eli and Marcus, that moment had not yet revealed its weight, but it had already settled into place. Their lives were moving steadily toward an intersection they could not predict, shaped by a memory they did not yet know would matter. Somewhere beyond their awareness, Serena Caldwell's forgotten moment waited intact, preparing to resurface in a way she never anticipated. The day the paths briefly overlapped did not feel important to Serena Caldwell. It arrived folded into a schedule already crowded with decisions, obligations, and calculations that demanded efficiency. To her, it was an interruption at most, a minor friction point in a day designed to move smoothly. She registered it the way powerful people often do, quickly, selectively, and without emotional investment. From Serena's vantage point, the setting was unremarkable. A public-facing environment designed to appear accessible while remaining carefully managed. She moved through it with the confidence of someone accustomed to being deferred to, guided, protected by invisible systems that anticipated inconvenience before it occurred. Her attention was fragmented, divided between what was immediately visible and what awaited her next. When something unexpected entered her field of awareness, she assessed it not for meaning, but for relevance. Eli and Marcus occupied the same space without occupying the same reality. They stood where they were allowed to stand, watched what they were allowed to watch, and waited without expectation. Their presence was unremarkable in a way that had become familiar to them. They were used to being peripheral, used to existing within arm's length of importance without ever being addressed by it. That day felt no different at first. The incident itself unfolded without confrontation. No raised voices, no spectacle. It was defined by absence rather than action. Serena noticed the boys only long enough to determine they required nothing from her that she was prepared to give. Her power made disengagement effortless. She did not need to explain, justify, or acknowledge. She simply redirected her focus and continued forward, confident that the moment would dissolve behind her. For Serena, it was not cruelty. It was prioritization. She believed that intent mattered more than impact, and her intent had not been malicious. She had not caused harm, she reasoned. She had simply declined involvement. In her world, that distinction carried weight. It absolved her. It allowed her to move on without hesitation. For the boys, the moment expanded instead of disappearing. They felt the shift immediately, though they did not yet have language for it. They understood instinctively that something had been decided without them. Not overtly, not dramatically, but definitively. The imbalance was unmistakable. One person's indifference had carried more authority than their combined presence. Eli processed the moment as confirmation. It aligned with patterns he had already observed. Power moved past them without friction. Attention was selective, and they were not among the selected. The experience did not surprise him, but it hardened something internal. It reinforced his understanding of how the world functioned, and where he stood within it. Marcus experienced it differently. He absorbed the emotional residue rather than the logic. What stayed with him was not the action itself, but the feeling of being unseen while fully present. It unsettled him because it contradicted a quieter belief he carried, that acknowledgement might arrive unexpectedly, that visibility could emerge without demand. That belief fractured silently. The imbalance of the moment was total. Serena exited unchanged, her day uninterrupted, her trajectory intact. The boys remained where they were, but something in them shifted. The same event produced unequal outcomes not because of its severity, but because of the positions held by those involved. Power insulated one party from consequence while exposing the other to meaning. This is where intention and impact diverged. Serena never intended to shape their lives. That was precisely the problem. Her disengagement carried more weight than she recognized because it occurred within a system already stacked against them. Her choice not to act did not exist in isolation. It landed on ground already eroded by neglect. What makes the moment morally shocking is not what Serena did, but how little it required of her to do differently. A pause, recognition, presence. None of these would have cost her anything measurable. Yet even these minimal acts were withheld, not out of malice, but because she did not perceive their value. As Serena moved on, the moment shrank in her memory, compressed until it resembled nothing at all. For Ellie and Marcus, it expanded, embedding itself into their understanding of the world. It became a reference point, a quiet fracture that influenced how they interpreted future encounters with authority and opportunity. What Serena dismissed as insignificant did not remain so. It settled into the boys' lives, shaping their awareness in ways that would take years to fully surface. The story does not reveal that impact yet, only hints at its depth. The audience is left with the unease of knowing that a single overlooked moment has already begun to reverberate, its consequences waiting patiently to unfold. Success gave Serena Caldwell distance, and distance gave her comfort. As her influence expanded, the past began to feel smaller, less defined, easier to compress into something abstract. Discomfort did not vanish, but it softened, losing its sharpness as it was surrounded by achievement. Serena did not confront what unsettled her, she outpaced it. She became skilled at this. Whenever something threatened to slow her forward motion, she reframed it as irrelevant. Time, she believed, was the most effective eraser. Moments unexamined eventually lost their edges, blending into the background of progress. The forgotten incident became one such moment. It lingered faintly, but never long enough to demand reflection. Wealth helped in ways Serena rarely acknowledged. It created insulation, not just from criticism but from accountability. Problems could be delegated, reframed, or absorbed by systems designed to protect her from friction. Responsibility became diffused across advisors, institutions, and initiatives. Even when discomfort surfaced, it could be managed without emotional exposure. This was not denial in its loudest form. It was subtle, efficient, and socially acceptable. Serena did not tell herself she was blameless. She told herself the moment no longer mattered. That distinction allowed her to move forward without revisiting the imbalance she had once witnessed. Guilt, if it appeared, arrived quietly and left quickly, never developing into remorse. Her philanthropy played a role in this internal arrangement. Giving back offered resolution without confrontation. It allowed Serena to feel aligned with justice without addressing specific instances where justice had been absent. The scale of her generosity blurred the need for precision. Large gestures replaced small acknowledgments. The past was addressed broadly, never personally. Over time, this approach hardened into belief. Serena began to trust that responsibility expired if left untouched long enough. The illusion was reinforced by success itself. Nothing in her life contradicted it. Her reputation flourished, her influence grew. The world responded to her as if she were complete, resolved, unburdened. That response became evidence. Yet beneath the surface, something remained unsettled. It surfaced not as memory but as tension. A brief discomfort when certain stories crossed her awareness. A flicker of impatience when vulnerability entered conversations she could not control. These moments passed quickly, dismissed as fatigue or distraction, but they accumulated quietly. Serena's success demanded constant motion. Stillness felt inefficient, even risky. Reflection required pausing, and pausing created space for unresolved thoughts. She avoided that space instinctively. Her life was designed to remain full, structured, and forward-facing. There was no room for quiet interrogation of past choices. What she did not realize was that burying truth does not neutralize it. It preserves it. The past, left untouched, does not dissolve. It waits intact, unaffected by the passage of time that dulls memory but sharpens consequence. Serena mistook silence for closure. The bittersweet tension of this chapter lies in how reasonable her behavior appears. Many would admire her discipline, her refusal to dwell, her ability to move on. The story does not present her as cruel, only incomplete. Her success is genuine, but it is built atop an unexamined foundation. As Serena continued to ascend, the world around her reflected only what she allowed it to see. She believed she had mastered narrative control entirely. What she failed to account for were the unintended channels through which the past can resurface. Memory does not always return directly. Sometimes it arrives through others. Unbeknownst to her, the moment she had buried was no longer confined to her own internal archive. It had been carried forward, interpreted, and reshaped beyond her reach. While she believed time had erased responsibility, something else was already moving, quietly connecting the past to a future she could not control. Despite her efforts to distance herself, the buried truth began to stir, preparing to re-enter her life not as accusation, but as consequence arriving from directions she never anticipated. Time did not soften the memory for Ely Brooks and Marcus Reed. Instead, it reshaped it. As years passed, the moment they had once experienced as confusion began to reveal layers they could not have understood at the time. Poverty did not allow them the luxury of forgetting. Every experience was examined for usefulness, every disappointment studied for instruction. Pain, when repeated often enough, demanded interpretation. Ely approached the memory analytically. As he grew older, he revisited it not with emotion, but with questions. He compared it to other moments when authority had passed him by, when opportunity had been visible but unreachable. Patterns emerged. The incident became less personal and more structural. It taught him that power rarely announces itself and that exclusion is often silent. This realization did not embitter him, but it made him deliberate. He began to think in terms of systems rather than individuals. Marcus, on the other hand, internalized the moment differently. He did not dissect it. He carried it. Where Ely sought explanation, Marcus sought direction. The feeling of being unseen stayed with him, not as anger, but as motivation. He became quietly purposeful, attentive to the emotional undercurrents others ignored. He noticed who was overlooked, who waited without acknowledgement, who learned early how to exist without assurance. The memory sharpened his empathy rather than his logic. Their poverty accelerated this divergence. Limited resources forced them to mature selectively. There was no space for dramatizing hardship, no audience for suffering. Growth happened privately, incrementally, without recognition. The incident with Serena became one of many reference points, but it held a particular weight because it represented the clearest imbalance they had encountered. It was the first time they consciously recognized how easily significance could be denied. What they learned from it was not resignation. It was clarity. Poverty did not teach them to accept injustice, it taught them to see it without illusion. They understood that meaning could not be granted by those in power. It had to be constructed internally, often in opposition to circumstance. This understanding shaped their choices in subtle ways. Ely began to value preparation over hope. He believed that awareness could be leveraged, that understanding the mechanics of exclusion could one day be used to navigate or disrupt them. He did not dream loudly, but he planned quietly. The memory informed his caution, his insistence on self-sufficiency, his reluctance to rely on goodwill. Marcus moved toward service without naming it as such. He gravitated toward roles that placed him near people, near moments of quiet vulnerability. The memory had taught him how much presence mattered. He learned that acknowledgement, even without resources, could alter someone's experience. He did not frame this as purpose, only as instinct. It felt necessary. The story does not romanticize their struggle. Their growth did not come with rewards or clarity. There were setbacks, doubts, long periods where progress felt invisible. Poverty remained a constraint, not a catalyst. But within that constraint, meaning continued to form. It grew not because of suffering, but because suffering demanded response. What united the boys was their shared refusal to let the moment remain meaningless. They did not speak of it often, but it influenced how they interpreted the world. It taught them that moments dismissed by the powerful could still shape lives profoundly. It reinforced the idea that significance was not determined by scale, but by impact. As they moved further from childhood, the incident stopped being about what had been denied and started becoming about what could be created. Their understanding expanded beyond survival. The memory evolved from a wound into a lens through which they viewed responsibility, presence, and agency. They did not yet know where this understanding would lead. They only knew it had changed them. The moment that once marked their exclusion was no longer just a reminder of scarcity. It had become a quiet foundation for something larger, something not yet fully visible, but steadily forming beneath the surface of their lives. Years later, the distance between Serena Caldwell's world and the lives of Ely Brooks and Marcus Reed appeared absolute. Yet distance has a way of collapsing without warning. The near intersection did not announce itself as destiny. It arrived disguised as coincidence, subtle enough to be dismissed, precise enough to matter. Serena entered a public space shaped by influence and access, surrounded by people who anticipated her needs before she expressed them. The setting was neutral, transitional, designed for movement rather than memory. Ely and Marcus were there for reasons that had nothing to do with her. Their presence was functional, grounded, rooted in necessity rather than exposure. They moved through the same environment without expecting visibility. Time had taught them not to anticipate acknowledgement from places that operated above them. Yet awareness never left them. They noticed how the air shifted when power entered a room, how attention reoriented itself automatically, how space subtly reorganized around importance. The world's brushed edges briefly, a shared corridor. A moment of proximity measured in seconds. Serena passed close enough for recognition to have been possible, yet it did not occur. Not because she chose to ignore them, but because memory had no trigger. Faces without context rarely survive in the mind of someone accustomed to constant motion. The moment from years ago remained buried too deeply to surface without provocation. For Ely, the near intersection registered immediately. He recognized the structure before the person, the movement of authority, the quiet compliance of the environment. He sensed familiarity without certainty, a disturbance he could not fully articulate. It passed quickly, leaving behind an unsettled awareness. Marcus felt it differently. He experienced the absence more than the presence, the strange pull of a moment that felt unfinished without knowing why. Missed recognition defined the encounter. Not as failure, but as delay. The boys did not seek acknowledgement. They had long since learned its unpredictability. Still, something in the proximity stirred the memory they carried, pressing against the present without fully entering it. The past hovered, just out of reach, refusing to align itself neatly. Serena continued forward, unaware of how close she had come to a reckoning she did not yet understand. Her life remained intact, her narrative uninterrupted. From her perspective, the moment dissolved instantly, absorbed into the rhythm of movement and obligation. Yet even without recognition, something shifted. Not in her awareness, but in the story's alignment. Fate's restraint defines this chapter. The collision does not occur because it is not yet time. Meaning requires preparation on all sides. Ely and Marcus were still becoming. Serena was still insulated. The story resists immediacy, allowing tension to stretch rather than resolve. What matters is not the meeting, but the inevitability it suggests. The audience senses the pull of gravity here. The worlds have come too close to remain separate forever. The near intersection confirms what has been implied all along. The past is active, not static. It moves independently, aligning moments without asking permission. Recognition has been postponed, not denied. As the space clears and their paths diverge again, the air retains a residue of possibility. Nothing has been spoken. Nothing has been acknowledged. Yet something has been set in motion. The story tightens, drawing its lines inward. The collision no longer feels hypothetical. It feels scheduled, waiting for the moment when memory, meaning, and consequence finally converge. At the height of Serena Caldwell's influence, silence followed her more closely than praise. Rooms adjusted to her presence, conversations shortened, opinions softened. What appeared as respect gradually revealed itself as distance. Success had elevated her beyond interruption, but it had also removed friction, and with it, the ordinary signals that anchor a person to others. Her days were full yet oddly hollow. Decisions arrived continuously, each one significant, none of them intimate. She approved initiatives that affected thousands, but rarely felt the weight of a single life pressing back. The scale of her impact diluted emotional feedback. Applause came abstracted through reports and headlines, stripped of faces, stripped of consequence. Serena told herself this was the cost of leadership. Influence required insulation. To remain effective, she needed separation from noise, from volatility, from moral exhaustion. Wealth provided that barrier effortlessly. It filtered encounters, curated experiences, softened edges. Over time, protection became habit, and habit became identity. Yet something within her resisted full acceptance. In quiet moments, an unnamed fatigue surfaced. It was not burnout. It was moral tiredness, the dull ache of decisions made without personal engagement. She noticed it when philanthropy felt procedural, when gratitude felt transactional, when outcomes mattered more than encounters. These sensations passed quickly, but they returned with increasing frequency. Being untouchable carried a subtle loneliness. People approached Serena with caution, admiration, or expectation, rarely with candor. Relationships organized themselves around her status, not her presence. She was listened to carefully, but seldom heard. The emotional reciprocity that once grounded her had been replaced by deference. This disconnection did not register as pain, but as absence. Serena could not identify what was missing because it had faded gradually. Emotional resolution requires vulnerability, and vulnerability had become inefficient. She moved through life buffered by success, untouched by the friction that once shaped her judgment. The trade-off felt invisible until it began to weigh on her. The moment she had buried remained dormant, but its influence was detectable in these quiet costs. The discomfort she avoided years ago had multiplied into a broader unease. She sensed that something essential had been deferred, not resolved. Wealth had allowed her to postpone reckoning, but it had not eliminated the need for it. Her emotional armor, carefully constructed, showed its first signs of strain not through crisis, but through erosion. Small things unsettled her unexpectedly. Stories that mirrored neglect lingered longer than they should have. Encounters she would have once dismissed now left residue. The insulation was thinning. Serena did not connect these shifts to any specific memory. She only knew that control felt heavier than before. Being untouchable no longer felt like freedom. It felt like distance she had not chosen consciously, but could no longer ignore. Somewhere beneath her success, something was pressing upward, testing the limits of the protection she had relied on for so long. That pressure did not announce itself as accusation. It arrived as curiosity she could not suppress, as moments when efficiency failed to satisfy. Serena found herself pausing where she once moved through automatically. These pauses unsettled her because they suggested a fracture in her momentum. Something unexpected was happening beneath the surface, loosening the emotional armor she had trusted. She did not yet recognize its source, only its persistence, and that persistence marked the beginning of a reckoning she could no longer indefinitely delay. This shift did not frighten her, but it disturbed the balance she had perfected. Serena sensed that insulation had limits, and that distance could not substitute for resolution forever. The story tightens here, not through confrontation, but through awareness. The cost of being untouchable was finally becoming visible, and with it, the realization that protection can also preserve what it was meant to bury. Without intending to, Serena had begun to listen inwardly. The silence that once felt secure now carried questions. Something long deferred was moving closer, patient and unresolved, preparing to surface when she was least prepared to control it. That awareness lingered, signaling that distance was ending and consequence was approaching. It was the first crack, subtle but irreversible, and it would not be the last. Silence could no longer protect her completely now. Stories like this don't ask for attention, they ask for reflection. If this journey stayed with you longer than expected, it means something here mattered. You already know what to do with stories that deserve to be remembered. And if you believe moments like these shouldn't stay buried, staying connected matters. Looking back now, is there a moment in your own life you once dismissed as small, only to realize later it may have meant everything to someone else?